Marcus Thompson had always been the kind of person who blended into the background. At 24, he possessed an unremarkable appearance that made him nearly invisible in crowds. His brown hair was perpetually messy, his clothes slightly too large, and his glasses constantly slipping down his nose. Most people dismissed him as just another desk clerk, which was exactly how he preferred it. The morning everything changed started like any other at the Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California. Marcus arrived at 0600 hours sharp, carrying his worn leather satchel and clutching a steaming cup of coffee that would be the first of many throughout the day. The security guard barely glanced up from his newspaper as Marcus badged in, offering only a grunt of acknowledgement. The hallways of the command center buzzed with activity even at this early hour. Muscular SEALs strode purposefully through the corridors, their confident bearing and precise movements marking them as elite warriors. They paid no attention to Marcus as he made his way to the administrative wing, just another civilian contractor lost among the real operators. Marcus had been working as an aide to Commander Jake Sullivan for 8 months now. Sullivan was a legendary SEAL who had seen action in 3 different theaters of operation. The commander was respected, feared, and admired in equal measure by his subordinates. He was also, Marcus had discovered, completely disorganized when it came to paperwork and scheduling. That was where Marcus came in. His official title was Administrative Support Specialist, but, in reality, he was Sullivan's keeper of schedules, filer of reports, and general keeper of organized chaos. The other SEALs viewed him as little more than a secretary, someone who handled the boring stuff while the real warriors did the important work. Marcus settled into his cramped office adjacent to Commander Sullivan's larger space. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, and his desk was covered with neat stacks of documents awaiting the commander's attention. Unlike the rest of the base, which had a distinctly military aesthetic, Marcus's office felt more like an accountant's workspace. He had just begun reviewing the day's agenda when Commander Sullivan burst through the connecting door. The SEAL commander was already fully dressed in his desert camouflage utilities, his face bearing the grim expression that Marcus had learned meant trouble was brewing. "Thompson, I need you to pull together everything we have on Operation Neptune's Fork," Sullivan barked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Admiral Morrison is coming for an inspection next week, and she's specifically asked about that mission." Marcus looked up from his computer screen, pushing his glasses up his nose. Admiral Victoria Morrison was a legend in the Navy, the first female admiral to oversee special operations. She had earned her position through decades of exceptional service and was known for her sharp intellect and no-nonsense approach to leadership. "All the files, sir?" Marcus asked, already knowing the answer would be yes. "Everything. Personnel records, mission reports, after-action reviews, equipment manifests, the works. And, Thompson, it needs to be perfect. Admiral Morrison doesn't tolerate sloppy work." Sullivan paused at the doorway, his expression softening slightly. "Look, I know this seems like busy work to you, but this inspection is important. Morrison has been pushing for changes in how we handle support operations, and there are rumors she's looking to shake things up around here." After Sullivan left, Marcus stared at his computer screen for a long moment. Operation Neptune's Fork had been a classified mission conducted 6 months before he arrived at the command. From what he could gather from casual conversations, it had been a success, but something about it had left the SEALs who participated reluctant to discuss details. Marcus began the painstaking process of pulling files from various databases and secure servers. His clearance level allowed him access to most administrative records, but many of the operational details remained beyond his reach. Still, he was thorough by nature, and he began building a comprehensive picture of the mission. As he worked, other members of the command staff filtered into the office complex. Lieutenant Rodriguez, Sullivan's operations officer, stopped by to drop off additional files. The young officer barely acknowledged Marcus's presence, treating him like a piece of office furniture. "Make sure you don't mess anything up," Rodriguez said dismissively. "Admiral Morrison has a reputation for destroying careers over paperwork errors." Marcus simply nodded, long accustomed to such treatment. He had learned early in his tenure that arguing or trying to assert himself only made things worse. It was easier to be underestimated and overlooked than to fight for respect he wasn't sure he deserved. The morning progressed quietly as Marcus methodically worked through the files. Operation Neptune's Fork had been a hostage rescue mission in a fictional Middle Eastern country. A team of 12 SEALs had successfully extracted 3 American diplomats from a terrorist compound. The mission had been completed without casualties, and all objectives had been achieved. But As Marcus dug deeper into the supporting documentation, he began to notice discrepancies. The equipment manifests didn't match the gear recovery reports. Communication logs showed radio traffic that wasn't reflected in the official timelines. Most puzzling of all, there seemed to be references to a 13th team member who wasn't listed on any of the official rosters. Marcus paused his work, uncertain whether these inconsistencies were clerical errors or something more significant. His instinct told him to flag them for Commander Sullivan's attention, but he also knew how the SEALs reacted to what they perceived as civilian interference in operational matters. Around 1,100 hours, the office was disrupted by the arrival of Chief Petty Officer Mike "Tank" Patterson. Tank was exactly what his nickname suggested, a massive man with arms like tree trunks and a chest that strained against his uniform shirt. He had served with Sullivan for over a decade and was considered one of the most experienced operators in the command. Tank barely glanced at Marcus as he strode into Sullivan's office, but when he emerged 20 minutes later, his expression was troubled. He stopped at Marcus's desk, an unusual occurrence that immediately caught Marcus's attention. "You're the one putting together the Neptune's Fork files?" Tank asked, his voice carrying the rough edge of someone who had spent years shouting over gunfire and explosions. "Yes, Chief. Is there something specific you need me to include?" Tank studied Marcus for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether the civilian aide could be trusted with sensitive information. Finally, he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Listen, Thompson, that mission, it wasn't as clean as the reports make it look. There were complications. Political complications. You need to make sure everything is exactly by the book when the Admiral shows up." Before Marcus could ask for clarification, Tank was gone, leaving him alone with more questions than answers. The Chief's warning had been deliberately vague, but the underlying message was clear. There were aspects of Operation Neptune's Fork that could cause problems if not handled carefully. Marcus spent the rest of the morning cross-referencing documents and trying to resolve the discrepancies he had discovered. The more he investigated, the more convinced he became that something significant had been left out of the official record. The missing team member, in particular, bothered him. Every other aspect of the mission had been meticulously documented, so why would one person be completely absent from the files? During his lunch break, Marcus decided to approach the problem from a different angle. Instead of focusing on what was in the files, he began looking at what was missing. Using his access to personnel databases, he started checking the duty rosters for the time periods surrounding the mission. What he found was intriguing. On the day of the mission, 13 SEALs had been marked as unavailable for duty, but only 12 names appeared on the operation roster. The 13th name belonged to Petty Officer First Class Sarah Chun, a communications specialist who had been assigned to Sullivan's team for just 2 months before the mission. Marcus stared at Chin's personnel file on his screen. She had an exemplary record, with commendations for technical expertise and tactical proficiency. More importantly, her specialty was exactly what would have been needed for a complex hostage rescue operation. So why wasn't she listed as a mission participant? Further investigation revealed that Chun had been transferred to a different command just 1 week after Operation Neptune's Fork. Her transfer orders were signed by someone well above Commander Sullivan's pay grade, and the new assignment was to a classified unit whose activities were completely compartmentalized. Marcus was beginning to understand that he had stumbled onto something much more complex than a simple administrative review. The discrepancies in the files weren't clerical errors. They were deliberate omissions designed to obscure certain aspects of the mission. The afternoon brought a steady stream of interruptions as various members of the command staff stopped by to check on Marcus's progress. Each visitor made it clear that they expected perfection in his work, but none offered any additional information that might help him resolve the inconsistencies he had discovered. Commander Sullivan returned from a training exercise around 1,600 hours, his uniform dusty and his mood foul. He immediately called Marcus into his office, closing the door behind them. "How's the file compilation coming?" Sullivan asked, settling behind his desk with a weary sigh. "Most of the documentation is ready, sir, but I've encountered some inconsistencies that I wanted to bring to your attention." Sullivan's expression hardened. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Marcus carefully explained his findings, focusing on the factual discrepancies rather than speculating about their cause. He presented the information in a clinical, professional manner, but he could see Sullivan growing increasingly uncomfortable with each detail. When Marcus finished his briefing, Sullivan was quiet for several minutes. The commander stared out his office window at the training compound where SEALs were conducting close-quarters combat exercises. "Thompson, "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room," Sullivan finally said. Operation Neptune's Fork was more complicated than the official record indicates. There were political considerations that required certain aspects of the mission to remain compartmentalized. The missing team member? Marcus asked. Petty Officer Chun was there, but her participation was unofficial. She wasn't supposed to be on that mission, but circumstances required her expertise. The decision was made at the highest levels to keep her involvement off the books. Marcus nodded, beginning to understand the delicate position he was in. "What do you need me to do about the files for Admiral Morrison's inspection?" "Stick to the official record," Sullivan said firmly. "Don't mention Chun or any of the discrepancies you've found. Admiral Morrison is coming here to evaluate our operations, not to dig into past missions that were successful despite their complications." That evening, Marcus remained in his office long after most of the base had gone quiet. He stared at his computer screen, wrestling with a difficult decision. Commander Sullivan had given him clear instructions to present only the sanitized version of Operation Neptune's Fork, but Marcus's sense of integrity rebelled against deliberately misleading a flag officer. He had always prided himself on his attention to detail and commitment to accuracy. Throughout his career, first in the private sector and now as a government contractor, he had built his reputation on providing complete and accurate information to his superiors. The idea of deliberately omitting important details felt like a betrayal of his professional ethics. At the same time, Marcus understood that he was operating in a world with different rules. Military operations often involve classified information and compartmentalized access. Just because he had stumbled across inconsistencies didn't mean he was supposed to act on them. Marcus pulled up Petty Officer Chen's personnel file one more time, studying her photograph and service record. She had served her country with distinction, earning commendations for her technical skills and dedication to duty. If she had participated in Operation Neptune's Fork, she deserved to have her contributions acknowledged, not erased from history for political convenience. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted his thoughts. Marcus quickly minimized the personnel file and pulled up a mundane scheduling document. Chief Patterson appeared in his doorway, looking surprised to find Marcus still at work. "Burning the midnight oil, Thompson?" Tank asked, stepping into the office. "Just trying to make sure everything is perfect for the Admiral's visit," Marcus replied, grateful that his voice sounded steady. Tank closed the door behind him and took a seat across from Marcus's desk. The big man's expression was serious, and Marcus sensed that another important conversation was about to take place. "I've been thinking about our chat this morning," Tank said slowly. "About the Neptune's Fork files. I want you to understand something about how things work in our world." Marcus waited, sensing that Tank was choosing his words carefully. Sometimes, good people get caught up in situations beyond their control. Sometimes, doing the right thing in the moment means accepting that the official record might not tell the whole story. Petty Officer Chun is one of the finest sailors I've ever served with. And what happened to her after Neptune's Fork? Well, let's just say she paid a price for being excellent at her job. "What kind of price?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind that ends careers quietly, without fanfare or explanation." Chun was transferred to a desk job at a training facility in the middle of nowhere. Officially, it was a promotion. Unofficially, it was exile. Tank leaned forward, his expression intense. "The point I'm trying to make, Thompson, is that sometimes the best way to honor good people is to not drag their names into situations where they can be hurt again." After Tank left, Marcus sat alone in his office, feeling the weight of conflicting responsibilities. He understood the chief's message. Revealing Chin's involvement in Operation Neptune's Fork might only bring more unwanted attention to a sailor who had already suffered enough. But Marcus also couldn't shake the feeling that Admiral Morrison's inspection might be exactly the right time to address these issues. Morrison had a reputation for fairness and integrity, and she might be the one person in the Navy hierarchy who could ensure that Chun received proper recognition for her service. As the clock approached 2,200 hours, Marcus made his decision. He would prepare two versions of the Operation Neptune's Fork documentation. The first would be the sanitized version that Commander Sullivan had requested, containing only the officially acknowledged participants and activities. The second would be a complete and accurate record that included all the information he had discovered. Marcus worked methodically through the night, ensuring that both versions were thoroughly documented and professionally presented. He wasn't sure which version he would ultimately provide to Admiral Morrison, but he wanted to have options when the time came. The next few days passed quickly as the entire command prepared for Admiral Morrison's inspection. Marcus found himself working longer hours, coordinating schedules, and ensuring that every aspect of the administrative review would go smoothly. The pressure was intense, with everyone from Commander Sullivan down to the newest enlisted personnel feeling the weight of expectation. 3 days before the scheduled inspection, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. A woman in navy dress blues appeared at his office door, her bearing marking her as an officer despite the fact that Marcus didn't recognize her rank insignia. "Mr. Thompson? I'm Lieutenant Commander Jessica Walsh from Admiral Morrison's staff. I wanted to discuss the documentation you've been preparing for our visit." Marcus stood and offered Walsh a seat, suddenly feeling nervous about this unexpected development. The lieutenant commander was professional but friendly, with an air of competence that reminded Marcus of Admiral Morrison's reputation. "Is there something specific you need from me, ma'am?" Marcus asked. Walsh smiled. "Actually, I'm here because Admiral Morrison has received some interesting information about your work. She's heard that you're exceptionally thorough in your research and documentation." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Had someone reported his investigation into the Operation Neptune's Fork discrepancies? Was he about to be removed from his position for overstepping his boundaries? "I'm just trying to do my job to the best of my ability," Marcus replied carefully. "And that's exactly why Admiral Morrison wants to speak with you personally when she arrives. She's interested in hearing your perspective on the operations you've been reviewing." Walsh leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. "Mr. Thompson, Admiral Morrison has built her career on the principle that the truth, however complicated, is always preferable to convenient fiction. She's coming here not just to conduct a routine inspection, but to evaluate how this command handles transparency and accountability." Marcus realized that he was at a crossroads. Lieutenant Commander Walsh seemed to be giving him permission, or perhaps even encouragement, to share his complete findings with Admiral Morrison. But acting on that invitation would mean going against Commander Sullivan's explicit instructions. "I understand, ma'am. I'll be ready to brief Admiral Morrison on whatever she needs to know." Walsh stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Mr. Thompson, one more thing. Admiral Morrison has a particular interest in recognizing service members whose contributions may have been overlooked or undervalued. She believes that every sailor's service deserves to be properly acknowledged." After Walsh left, Marcus sat staring at his computer screen, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his shoulders. Admiral Morrison's inspection was no longer just a routine administrative review. It was an opportunity to address the injustices that had been swept under the rug for political convenience. Marcus pulled up both versions of his Operation Neptune's Fork documentation, reading through them one final time. The sanitized version told the story of a successful mission executed by a well-trained team. The complete version told the story of a successful mission that had been achieved partly through the unofficial contribution of a talented sailor who had subsequently been punished for her excellence. He thought about Petty Officer Chun, exiled to a training facility for the crime of being too good at her job. He thought about Chief Patterson's warning about not dragging good people into situations where they could be hurt. He thought about Commander Sullivan's trust in his discretion. But, mostly, he thought about Admiral Morrison's reputation for integrity and her commitment to recognizing overlooked contributions. This might be the only chance to ensure that Sarah Chen's service was properly acknowledged. Marcus made his final decision. When Admiral Morrison arrived, he would present her with the complete truth about Operation Neptune's Fork, regardless of the personal consequences. It was time for someone to stand up for what was right, even if that someone was just an underestimated civilian aide whom most people barely noticed. The die was cast, and Marcus Thompson was about to discover that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on distant battlefields, but in the quiet corners of administrative offices where the truth waits patiently to be revealed. The morning of Admiral Morrison's arrival dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of California sunshine that made the Naval Special Warfare Command look picture-perfect. Marcus arrived earlier than usual, his stomach churning with nervous energy as he made final preparations for what would either be the most important day of his career or the day it ended in spectacular failure. Commander Sullivan had been unusually tense all week, barking orders and double-checking every detail of the inspection preparations. The entire command buzzed with barely controlled anxiety as hundreds of personnel prepared to showcase their operations to one of the Navy's most respected flag officers. Marcus had spent the previous evening meticulously organizing his documentation. Both versions of the Operation Neptune's Fork file sat on his desk in pristine folders, each marked with different colored tabs for easy identification. The sanitized version bore a simple white tab, while the complete truth was marked with a red tab that seemed to pulse with significance in the morning light. At 0800 hours, the base public address system crackled to life with an announcement that Admiral Morrison's convoy had arrived at the main gate. Marcus watched through his office window as a small motorcade of black SUVs made its way across the compound, flanked by military police escorts. The sight sent a fresh wave of nervous energy through his chest. Commander Sullivan appeared in Marcus's office doorway, his dress uniform immaculate, and his expression grim. "Thompson, the Admiral will be conducting individual briefings with key personnel starting at 1000 hours. You're scheduled for 10:30. Are you ready?" Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. Sullivan studied him for a moment, his experienced eyes searching for any sign of uncertainty or rebellion. "Remember what we discussed about sticking to the official record," Sullivan said quietly. "Admiral Morrison is here to evaluate our current operations, not to relitigate past missions." "I understand, sir." But, as Sullivan left, Marcus knew that his commander's trust was about to be tested in the most fundamental way possible. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back now. The morning crawled by with agonizing slowness. Marcus tried to focus on routine administrative tasks, but his mind kept wandering to the upcoming briefing. Every few minutes, he would glance at the red-tabbed folder containing the complete Operation Neptune's fork documentation, wondering if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. At 0945 hours, Lieutenant Commander Walsh appeared at his office door again, this time accompanied by a tall, stern-looking man in navy dress blues whom she introduced as Captain Rodriguez, Admiral Morrison's chief of staff. "Mr. Thompson, we wanted to give you a final briefing before you meet with Admiral Morrison," Walsh said, taking a seat across from his desk. Captain Rodriguez remained standing, his imposing presence filling the small office. "The Admiral has reviewed your personnel file, Thompson. She's impressed by your background and your reputation for thoroughness. She's specifically interested in your analysis of the documentation you've been reviewing." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "My analysis, sir?" "Admiral Morrison doesn't just want to see paperwork," Walsh explained. "She wants to understand how operations are really conducted, how information flows through the command structure, and whether there are systemic issues that need to be addressed." Captain Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. "Thompson, the Admiral has reason to believe that this command may have some transparency issues. She's looking for honest, objective feedback from someone who isn't part of the operational chain of command." The implications were clear. Admiral Morrison's inspection wasn't the routine administrative review that Commander Sullivan had described. It was a targeted investigation into how the Special Warfare Command handled sensitive operations, and whether information was being properly reported up the chain. "Sir, ma'am, I'll provide whatever information Admiral Morrison needs," Marcus replied, his decision crystallizing into absolute certainty. At exactly 1030 hours, Marcus walked into the conference room that had been designated as Admiral Morrison's temporary office. He carried both folders, though he had already decided which one would be opened. Admiral Victoria Morrison was smaller in stature than her reputation suggested, but her presence filled the room with unmistakable authority. She sat behind a polished conference table, her silver hair pulled back in a precise bun, and her dark eyes studying Marcus with keen intelligence. Her uniform was adorned with rows of ribbons that told the story of a distinguished career spanning 3 decades of service. "Mr. Thompson, please have a seat," Admiral Morrison said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me." Marcus settled into the chair across from her, placing his folders on the table but keeping his hands folded in his lap. The room was quiet except for the distant sounds of base operations filtering through the windows. "I've heard excellent things about your work here," Morrison continued. "Commander Sullivan speaks very highly of your organizational skills and attention to detail. Lieutenant Commander Walsh tells me you've been particularly thorough in your review of Operation Neptune's fork. I try to be comprehensive in my documentation, Admiral." Morrison leaned back in her chair, studying Marcus with an expression that seemed to see right through any pretense. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to be direct with you because I believe you're the kind of person who appreciates directness. I'm not here just to review paperwork. I'm here because I've received information suggesting that this command may have issues with transparency and accountability." Marcus felt his mouth go dry, but he forced himself to maintain eye contact with the Admiral. "Specifically," Morrison continued, I've received reports that certain aspects of operations may be deliberately omitted from official documentation for political reasons. I'm told that you may have discovered some of these discrepancies. The moment of truth had arrived. Marcus reached for the red-tabbed folder, his decision made irrevocably clear by Admiral Morrison's words. "Admiral, I have prepared 2 different briefings for you today," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he had expected. "One contains the officially approved documentation for Operation Neptune's Fork. The other contains what I believe to be the complete and accurate record of that mission." Morrison's eyes sharpened with interest. "And what's the difference between these 2 versions?" Marcus opened the complete file and began his presentation, methodically walking Admiral Morrison through every discrepancy he had discovered. He explained the missing equipment manifests, the inconsistent communication logs, and, most importantly, the absence of Petty Officer Sarah Chun from the official roster despite clear evidence of her participation. As he spoke, Morrison took notes in a precise, military hand, occasionally asking pointed questions that demonstrated her deep understanding of special operations procedures. She showed particular interest in Chin's personnel file and the circumstances of her transfer following the mission. "Tell me about Petty Officer Chun," Morrison said when Marcus finished his presentation. Marcus pulled up Chin's service record on his tablet, turning it so Admiral Morrison could see the screen. According to her file, she's an exceptional communications specialist with extensive training in advanced encryption and battlefield communications. Her performance evaluations are consistently outstanding, and she has commendations for technical innovation. And yet she was transferred to a training facility immediately after a successful mission where her skills would have been crucial? "Yes, ma'am. The transfer orders were signed at a level well above Commander Sullivan's authority, and they were processed with unusual speed." Morrison was quiet for several minutes, studying the documentation with the focused intensity of someone who had spent years analyzing complex operational reports. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. "Mr. Thompson, what you've presented to me represents a serious failure of transparency in the reporting chain. The question is whether this was an isolated incident or part of a broader pattern." Marcus hesitated, then decided to share one more piece of information that he had discovered during his research. "Admiral, if I may, I found something else that might be relevant." He pulled up a database query he had run the previous evening. "I searched for other operations where equipment manifests and personnel rosters showed similar discrepancies. There have been 3 other missions in the past 2 years where unofficial participants appear to have been involved but omitted from official records." Morrison's expression hardened. "All special operations missions?" "Yes, ma'am. All classified missions with sensitive political implications." The Admiral stood and walked to the window, looking out at the training compound where SEALs were conducting exercises. Marcus watched her profile, trying to gauge her reaction to the information he had provided. "Mr. Thompson, what you've uncovered suggests a systematic pattern of unauthorized personnel participating in classified operations, followed by deliberate omission from official records. This represents a serious breach of accountability procedures." She turned back to face Marcus, her expression grave. "I need you to understand the implications of what you've told me today. This information will likely trigger a comprehensive investigation into special operations procedures at this command." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "Yes, ma'am. I understand. I also need you to understand that your decision to bring this information forward, despite what I'm sure were clear instructions to stick to the sanitized version, demonstrates exactly the kind of integrity that the Navy needs in its support personnel." Morrison returned to her seat, her demeanor shifting slightly from interrogator to mentor. "Mr. Thompson, can you tell me why you decided to present the complete information despite the obvious risks to your position here?" Marcus had been dreading this question, but now that it had been asked, he found the answer came easily. "Admiral, I've spent my career building a reputation for providing accurate, complete information to decision-makers. When I learned about Petty Officer Chin's situation, I realized that maintaining my professional integrity meant ensuring that her service was properly acknowledged, even if it meant potentially ending your career at this command." "Yes, ma'am. Some principles are more important than job security." Morrison nodded slowly, making another note in her notebook. "Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that your decision today will not go unrecognized. However, I also need to prepare you for the fact that things are about to become very complicated around here." She closed her notebook and leaned forward slightly. "I'm going to be initiating a formal investigation into transparency and accountability procedures at this command. As the person who uncovered this information, You'll likely be called to testify in official proceedings. Are you prepared for that responsibility? Marcus thought about Commander Sullivan, Chief Patterson, and the other SEALs who had trusted him with sensitive information. He thought about the potential consequences of his decision, both for himself and for the men who had welcomed him into their professional family despite his civilian status. But, mostly, he thought about Petty Officer Sarah Chan, exiled to a training facility for the crime of excellence, and about the principle that honest service deserved honest recognition. I'm prepared, Admiral. Morrison smiled for the first time during the meeting, and Marcus was surprised by how much warmth the expression contained. Mr. Thompson, the Navy needs more people like you. People who understand that accountability isn't just about following orders, but about ensuring that those orders serve the greater good. She stood to conclude the meeting, and Marcus hastily gathered his files. As he prepared to leave, Morrison called his name one more time. Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that Petty Officer Chen's service will be properly acknowledged. Whatever mistakes were made in handling her situation will be corrected. Marcus felt a surge of emotion that he quickly suppressed. Thank you, Admiral. As Marcus walked back to his office, he was acutely aware that everything had changed. The quiet administrative aide who had spent months being overlooked and underestimated had just set in motion events that would shake the Special Warfare Command to its foundations. Word of Admiral Morrison's extended private meeting with Marcus spread quickly through the command. By afternoon, there were whispers in the hallways and meaningful glances exchanged among the senior enlisted personnel. Everyone seemed to sense that something significant had occurred, though few understood exactly what. Commander Sullivan was notably absent from his office for the remainder of the day, attending a series of meetings with Admiral Morrison and her staff. When he finally returned at 1,700 hours, his expression was thunderous. Marcus was still at his desk, having spent the afternoon documenting his meeting with Admiral Morrison and preparing for whatever would come next. When Sullivan appeared in his doorway, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Thompson, my office. Now, Marcus followed the commander into his private office, noting that Sullivan closed the door with unnecessary force. The SEAL officer stood behind his desk, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. What exactly did you tell Admiral Morrison? Sullivan's voice was carefully controlled, but Marcus could hear the anger simmering beneath the surface. I provided her with complete and accurate documentation of Operation Neptune's Fork, sir, including the information I specifically instructed you to omit. Marcus met Sullivan's gaze steadily. Yes, sir. Sullivan turned away, staring out his office window at the darkening sky. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of disappointment and betrayal. Thompson, do you have any idea what you've done? Admiral Morrison has just informed me that she's initiating a formal investigation into our operations. She's questioning our methods, our integrity, and our judgment based on information that you provided despite explicit instructions to the contrary. Marcus felt the full impact of his decision settling on his shoulders. Commander Sullivan was a good man who had trusted him with sensitive responsibilities, and Marcus had repaid that trust by going against direct orders. Sir, I believe Admiral Morrison needed the complete picture to make informed decisions. Sullivan spun around, his frustration finally boiling over. The complete picture? Thompson, you don't understand the first thing about how special operations work in the real world. Sometimes, good people make difficult decisions in impossible situations. Sometimes, the official record doesn't capture the full complexity of what happened because the full complexity would destroy careers and compromise future operations. Marcus remained silent, understanding that Sullivan needed to vent his frustration, but also standing firm in his conviction that he had made the right choice. Petty Officer Chun volunteered for that mission, Sullivan continued, his voice rising. She knew the risks, including the risk that her participation would need to remain unofficial. She understood that her career might suffer, but she chose to put the mission first. And now, because of your idealistic notion of transparency, she's going to be dragged through an investigation that will only hurt her more. Marcus felt a stab of doubt. Had he made things worse for the very person he was trying to help? Sullivan must have seen the uncertainty in Marcus's expression because his tone softened slightly. Look, Thompson, I understand why you did what you did. You thought you were doing the right thing. But, in our world, the right thing isn't always the obvious thing. The commander walked around his desk and sat heavily in his chair, suddenly, looking older than his years. Admiral Morrison has suspended me pending the outcome of her investigation. Chief Patterson and 3 other senior personnel, are also under review. The entire command structure is being scrutinized because you decided that your version of integrity was more important than explicit orders from your superior officer. Marcus felt the full weight of the consequences his decision had set in motion. Good people were suffering because of his choice to reveal the truth about Operation Neptune's Fork. Sir, I'm sorry that my actions have caused difficulties for you and the team. That was never my intention. Sullivan looked up at him with an expression that mixed anger, disappointment, and grudging respect. Thompson, your intentions were good, but in military operations, good intentions aren't enough. Actions have consequences, and those consequences ripple through the lives of real people. The commander stood and walked to his office safe, retrieving a manila envelope that he placed on his desk. Admiral Morrison has requested that you be temporarily assigned to her investigation team as a subject matter expert. Congratulations, Thompson. You're about to get a front-row seat to watch the dismantling of one of the finest special operations commands in the Navy. As Marcus prepared to leave Sullivan's office, the commander called his name one final time. Thompson, I want you to remember something. Whatever happens in the coming weeks, the men and women of this command are patriots who have risked their lives in service to their country. They deserve better than to have their careers destroyed by an investigation triggered by an aide who thought he knew better than his superiors. Marcus walked back to his office in a daze, the full implications of his decision finally becoming clear. He had set out to ensure that Sarah Chen's service was properly recognized, but in the process, he had potentially destroyed the careers of other good people who had simply been trying to do their jobs in an imperfect world. His small office felt different now, tainted by the knowledge that his work had triggered events beyond his control. The files on his desk, which had once represented simple administrative tasks, now felt like instruments of destruction. Marcus sat in his chair and stared at his computer screen, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. The principle of transparency and accountability seemed less clear-cut when measured against the very real human cost of his revelations. As evening settled over the Naval Special Warfare Command, Marcus Thompson realized that being right and doing right were sometimes two very different things. And in the complex world of special operations, the consequences of that difference could be devastating for everyone involved. The quiet administrative aide who had always blended into the background had suddenly become the most important person on the base, and he wasn't sure he was prepared for the responsibilities that came with that recognition. 3 weeks after Admiral Morrison's investigation began, Marcus found himself occupying a strange position within the Naval Special Warfare Command. No longer the invisible administrative aide, he had been temporarily reassigned to work directly with the investigation team while maintaining his regular duties. The result was a bizarre existence where some personnel treated him as a pariah while others regarded him with newfound, if wary, respect. The investigation had moved quickly, with Admiral Morrison's team conducting interviews with dozens of personnel and reviewing thousands of pages of documentation. Marcus had been called to testify 3 times, each session lasting several hours as investigators probed every aspect of his discoveries about Operation Neptune's Fork and the other missions with suspicious discrepancies. Commander Sullivan had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome, leaving the daily operations of his unit in the hands of his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes. Hayes was a capable officer, but she made no attempt to hide her resentment toward Marcus for his role in triggering the chaos that had engulfed their command. The atmosphere on the base had grown increasingly tense as personnel were called in for interviews, their careers hanging in the balance based on their knowledge of or participation in the questionable operational procedures. Marcus found himself eating lunch alone, as most of the SEALs and support staff now viewed him as a threat rather than a colleague. The isolation was particularly difficult because Marcus had genuinely liked working at the command. Despite being underestimated and overlooked, he had felt privileged to support the mission of America's elite warriors. Now, that privilege felt more like a burden as he watched good people suffer the consequences of decisions that predated his arrival. Chief Patterson had been one of the personnel called for extensive questioning, and when he emerged from his 3rd interview session, he looked haggard and defeated. Marcus encountered the big man in the hallway outside the conference rooms being used by the investigation team. "Tank, how are you holding up?" Marcus asked, genuinely concerned about the chief's welfare. Patterson stopped and studied Marcus with tired eyes. "You really want to know, Thompson? I'm looking at a possible administrative action that could end my career 3 years before I'm eligible for retirement. 22 years of service, multiple combat deployments, commendations for valor, and it might all end because I followed orders from my commanding officer. Marcus felt the familiar stab of guilt that had become his constant companion over the past 3 weeks. Chief, I never intended for good people like you to get caught up in this. Patterson's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing the genuine remorse in Marcus's voice. I know you didn't, son, but intentions don't change outcomes. The road to hell, and all that. The chief paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to share something more. Finally, he continued, Thompson, there's something you need to understand about the military. Sometimes, we operate in gray areas because the real world doesn't fit neatly into regulation manuals. Sarah Chun volunteered for that mission because she knew her skills were needed, and she accepted that her participation would have to remain unofficial. Marcus had heard variations of this argument from several people over the past weeks, but he still struggled to accept the logic. But, Chief, doesn't she deserve recognition for her service? Doesn't the Navy deserve accurate records of how missions are conducted? Patterson smiled grimly. You're not wrong, Thompson, but you're not entirely right either. Chin's sacrifice wasn't just participating in a dangerous mission. It was accepting that she might never receive credit for that participation. She understood that sometimes the mission is more important than personal recognition. Before Marcus could respond, Patterson continued, the thing is, Admiral Morrison's investigation isn't just about transparency. It's about politics. Chin's unofficial participation in Neptune's fork involved political considerations that go way above our pay grades. By forcing this into the open, you've created political problems for people who don't deserve them. As Patterson walked away, Marcus was left to contemplate the complexity of the situation he had helped create. The more he learned about the political ramifications of his revelations, the less confident he became that he had made the right choice. Later that day, Marcus received an unexpected phone call from Lieutenant Commander Walsh, who had been serving as Admiral Morrison's liaison for personnel interviews. Mr. Thompson, Admiral Morrison would like to meet with you again this afternoon. Can you be available at 1,500 hours? Marcus agreed, wondering what new developments had prompted another meeting with the Admiral. Over the past 3 weeks, he had come to respect Morrison's intelligence and integrity, but he had also begun to understand that her investigation was having consequences far beyond the Naval Special Warfare Command. At the appointed time, Marcus found himself once again sitting across from Admiral Morrison in the conference room that had become her temporary command center. The Admiral looked tired, and Marcus noticed that her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of the stress she was under. Mr. Thompson, thank you for coming. I wanted to update you on the status of our investigation and discuss some developments that affect you directly. Morrison opened a file folder and consulted her notes before continuing. First, I want you to know that your information about Operation Neptune's Fork and the other missions has been substantiated. We've confirmed that there were indeed systematic failures in transparency and accountability procedures. Marcus nodded, unsure whether this vindication of his findings was good news or bad news given the human cost of the investigation. However, Morrison continued, the political implications of these findings have become more complex than I initially anticipated. The unofficial participation of personnel in classified operations raises questions about command authority and oversight that extend beyond this installation. The Admiral leaned back in her chair, studying Marcus with an expression that seemed to convey both appreciation and concern. Mr. Thompson, your decision to bring these discrepancies to my attention was professionally correct and morally justified. However, I need you to understand that the consequences of that decision are rippling through the Navy hierarchy in ways that neither of us anticipated. Marcus felt his stomach clench with apprehension. What kind of consequences, Admiral? The Pentagon is now involved, as are several congressional oversight committees. The question of unofficial personnel participation in classified operations has implications for budgeting, authorization, and legal liability that could affect special operations across all military branches. Morrison paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. In short, Mr. Thompson, your commitment to accuracy and transparency has triggered a review process that could fundamentally change how special operations are conducted throughout the Department of Defense. The magnitude of what Morrison was describing overwhelmed Marcus. He had thought he was simply correcting administrative errors, but apparently he had stumbled into issues that threatened the entire special operations community. Admiral, I need to ask directly, did I make a mistake? Should I have followed Commander Sullivan's instructions and presented only the sanitized version? Morrison was quiet for several minutes, and Marcus could see her weighing her response carefully. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 3 decades navigating the complex intersection of military necessity and political reality. Mr. Thompson, you made the only choice that was consistent with your professional integrity and personal ethics. Whether that was the right choice depends on how you measure rightness. If you measure it by adherence to truth and accountability, then, yes, you made the right choice. If you measure it by minimizing harm to good people caught in an imperfect system, then, the answer is more complicated. She leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more personal. What I can tell you is that your decision has forced a conversation that was long overdue. The practices you uncovered weren't unique to this command, and they weren't sustainable. Eventually, someone was going to notice the discrepancies, and the longer they went unaddressed, the worse the eventual consequences would have been. Marcus found some comfort in Morrison's words, but the guilt over the suffering of people like Chief Patterson and Commander Sullivan continued to weigh heavily on his conscience. Admiral, what's going to happen to the personnel who are under investigation? That depends on several factors, including their level of involvement in the decision-making process and their cooperation with our investigation. I can tell you that I'm recommending leniency for personnel who were following orders from their superiors, while focusing accountability on the command level where policy decisions were made. Morrison consulted her notes again before continuing. Which brings me to another matter. Mr. Thompson, your role in uncovering these issues has not gone unnoticed at higher levels. I've received inquiries about your background and your potential availability for other assignments. Marcus felt a chill of apprehension. Other assignments? There are positions within the Navy's Inspector General Office and other oversight organizations that could benefit from someone with your analytical skills and commitment to accuracy. Your work on this investigation has demonstrated exactly the kind of independent thinking that's needed in accountability roles. The offer was flattering, but Marcus realized that accepting such a position would essentially end his career in operational support. He would be typecast as an investigator, someone who found problems rather than solved them. Admiral, I appreciate the consideration, but I'm not sure that kind of role is what I'm looking for in my career. Morrison smiled. I understand your reluctance, Mr. Thompson. However, I want you to think about the broader impact of what you've accomplished here. Your commitment to truth has helped expose systemic problems that needed to be addressed. That's valuable work, even if it doesn't feel rewarding in the immediate term. As the meeting concluded, Morrison provided Marcus with one more piece of information that would prove significant in the days to come. Mr. Thompson, I've arranged for you to meet with Petty Officer Chen next week. She's being transferred back to active operational duty, and I thought you might want to see the person whose service you helped to recognize. The prospect of meeting Chen both excited and terrified Marcus. She was the focal point of his decision to reveal the truth about Operation Neptune's Fork, but he wasn't sure how she would react to learning that his actions had triggered a major investigation. Over the next few days, Marcus tried to focus on his regular administrative duties while the investigation continued around him. The command was still functioning, but the atmosphere remained tense as personnel waited for final determinations about their careers. Marcus found himself spending more time alone, partly by choice and partly because many of his former colleagues were avoiding him. The isolation gave him time to reflect on the choices he had made and their consequences, but it also amplified his doubts about whether he had done the right thing. 3 days before his scheduled meeting with Petty Officer Chen, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Commander Sullivan appeared at his office door, looking older and more tired than Marcus had ever seen him. The SEAL officer had been cleared to return to duty pending final investigation results, but his career trajectory had been permanently altered by the revelations about his command practices. Thompson, do you have a few minutes? Sullivan's tone was neutral, giving no indication of his emotional state. Marcus gestured for the commander to take a seat, bracing himself for another difficult conversation about the consequences of his decision. Sullivan settled into the chair across from Marcus's desk and was quiet for several minutes, seemingly gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that spoke to the toll the investigation had taken on him. Thompson, I owe you an apology. Not for following your conscience, but for putting you in a position where following your conscience required going against direct orders from your superior. Marcus was stunned by the admission. He had expected anger, resentment, or at best grudging acceptance, but not an apology. Sir, you don't need to apologize. I understood the risks when I made my decision. Sullivan held up a hand to stop Marcus's response. Let me finish. Over the past few weeks, I've had a lot of time to think about the choices I made and the position I put you in. I asked you to compromise your integrity to protect what I thought were legitimate operational necessities. That was unfair to you, and it was ultimately counterproductive. The commander leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Admiral Morrison's investigation has shown me that the practices we developed weren't sustainable. We were trying to manage political complications by compartmentalizing information, but that approach was bound to create problems eventually. Marcus found himself in the unusual position of defending the man who had originally ordered him to conceal the truth. Sir, I understand why you made the decisions you did. You were trying to protect your people and preserve operational flexibility. Sullivan smiled grimly. That's generous of you, Thompson. But the fact remains that I created a system where good people like Sarah Chun paid a price for doing exceptional work. That's on me, not on the political complications that made it seem necessary. The conversation continued for another hour, with Sullivan providing Marcus with context about the political pressures that had shaped his decision-making. Marcus began to understand that the commander had been caught between competing obligations, loyalty to his personnel, operational security requirements, and political considerations that came from well above his level of authority. As Sullivan prepared to leave, he offered Marcus one final observation that would stay with him for years to come. Thompson, what you did took courage, but not the kind of courage that most people think about. It didn't take physical bravery to reveal those discrepancies. It took moral courage to accept the consequences of being right when being right would hurt people you cared about. That's a rarer kind of courage than most people realize. After Sullivan left, Marcus sat alone in his office, processing the commander's words and preparing for his upcoming meeting with Petty Officer Chun. The investigation was nearing its conclusion, and final recommendations would soon be submitted to Navy leadership. Whatever happened next, Marcus knew that his time as an invisible administrative aide was over. The quiet man who had spent months being overlooked and underestimated had become the catalyst for changes that would affect special operations throughout the Navy. Whether those changes would ultimately prove beneficial remained to be seen, but there was no doubt that Marcus Thompson had left an indelible mark on the Naval Special Warfare Command. As he prepared for his meeting with the woman whose service had sparked his crisis of conscience, Marcus reflected on the complex nature of doing what's right in an imperfect world. He had learned that good intentions weren't always enough, that moral choices often came with unexpected consequences, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with paperwork and the courage to tell the truth regardless of the cost. The day Marcus was scheduled to meet Petty Officer Sarah Chun donned gray and overcast, matching his anxious mood. Despite Admiral Morrison's assurances that Chin's career would benefit from the investigation's findings, Marcus remained apprehensive about facing the woman whose service had sparked his decision to reveal the truth about Operation Neptune's Fork. Chin was scheduled to arrive at the Naval Special Warfare Command at 1,000 hours for briefings related to her new assignment. Admiral Morrison had arranged for Marcus to meet with her privately afterward, giving him the opportunity to explain his role in bringing her situation to light. Marcus spent the morning reviewing Chin's updated personnel file, which had been significantly enhanced since Admiral Morrison's investigation began. Her participation in Operation Neptune's Fork was now officially acknowledged, along with her contributions to 3 other classified missions. More importantly, her transfer to the training facility had been reversed, and she was being assigned to an elite communications unit that would make full use of her specialized skills. At 1,030 hours, Marcus's phone rang with a call from Lieutenant Commander Walsh. Mr. Thompson, Petty Officer Chun has completed her briefings and is available to meet with you now. She's in conference room C when you're ready. Marcus straightened his tie and gathered the documentation he had prepared for their meeting. As he walked through the corridors toward the conference room, he noticed that many of the personnel he passed seemed to regard him with a mixture of curiosity and respect that was markedly different from the previous weeks of suspicion and resentment. Conference room C was smaller than the room where Marcus had met with Admiral Morrison, with a simple rectangular table and 4 chairs arranged around it. Petty Officer Chin stood near the window, studying the view of the training compound where SEALs were conducting close-quarters combat exercises. Chin was smaller in stature than Marcus had expected, perhaps 5 feet 6 inches tall, with short black hair and an athletic build that spoke to years of military fitness requirements. Her dress blue uniform was impeccable, and Her bearing radiated the quiet confidence that Marcus had learned to associate with elite military personnel. "Petty Officer Chun, I'm Marcus Thompson," he said, offering his hand as he entered the room. Chun turned and studied him with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his appearance and demeanor. Her handshake was firm and professional. "Mr. Thompson, Admiral Morrison tells me I have you to thank for some recent developments in my career. I'm curious to hear your perspective on what happened." Chin's tone was neutral, giving Marcus no indication of whether she viewed his actions favorably or unfavorably. He gestured for her to take a seat and settled across from her at the conference table. "Petty Officer Chun, I want to start by saying that I hope my investigation into Operation Neptune's Fork hasn't caused you any additional difficulties. That was never my intention." Chin smiled slightly, the expression softening her serious features. "Mr. Thompson, let me put your mind at ease on that point. The investigation has actually resolved some difficulties that I've been living with for the past 6 months." Marcus felt a wave of relief, though he remained cautious about assuming that all the consequences of his actions had been positive. Chin leaned back in her chair and regarded Marcus with an expression of frank curiosity. "What I'd like to understand is what motivated you to dig into the discrepancies you found. Most administrative personnel would have accepted the sanitized version and moved on." Marcus had anticipated this question, but he still found it difficult to articulate his motivations without sounding either self-righteous or naive. He decided to be as honest as possible about his thought process. "Petty Officer Chun, when I discovered that someone had been omitted from the official record of a successful mission, it bothered me on a professional level. I've built my career on providing accurate information to decision-makers, and deliberately omitting someone's contributions felt wrong." Chin nodded thoughtfully. "But it was more than just professional standards, wasn't it? You took significant personal risks to bring this information to Admiral Morrison's attention." Marcus considered her observation, recognizing that she was probing for a deeper understanding of his motivations. "You're right. It became personal when I researched your background and realized that you had been punished for excellent performance. The idea that someone could be exiled for doing their job exceptionally well violated my sense of fairness." Chin was quiet for several minutes, seemingly processing Marcus's explanation. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of appreciation mixed with something that might have been amusement. "Mr. Thompson, you do realize that I volunteered for Operation Neptune's Fork knowing that my participation would have to remain unofficial? I understood the political complications and accepted that I might never receive official recognition for my contributions." Marcus felt a familiar stab of uncertainty about his decision. "Several people have told me that, and I understand why you made that choice. But I guess I couldn't accept that someone should have to sacrifice recognition for doing the right thing." Chin leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. "Let me tell you something about my experience after Neptune's Fork. Yes, I was transferred to a training facility, and yes, that transfer felt like punishment at the time. But it also gave me opportunities to develop new skills and work on projects that wouldn't have been available in a traditional operational assignment." Marcus was surprised by this perspective, having assumed that Chin's transfer had been entirely negative. Chun continued, "The problem wasn't that I was transferred, or even that my participation in the mission remained unofficial. The problem was that the transfer was handled in a way that suggested I had done something wrong rather than something exceptional." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "What your investigation accomplished, Mr. Thompson, wasn't just getting my contributions officially recognized. It forced a conversation about how the Navy handles personnel who are willing to take on unofficial responsibilities for the good of the mission." Marcus began to understand that the implications of his actions extended beyond Chin's individual situation. The investigation had highlighted systemic issues in how the Navy managed the intersection of operational necessity and official accountability. "Petty Officer Chun, can I ask how you feel about having your service record corrected? Was the recognition worth the disruption that the investigation caused?" Chun smiled more broadly this time, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the personality behind her professional demeanor. "Mr. Thompson, let me be clear about something. I didn't need official recognition for my own ego. I knew what I had contributed, and that was enough for me personally." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the SEALs conducting their training exercises. "But the principle behind your actions was important. The Navy can't function effectively if good performance is punished or if official records are routinely sanitized for political convenience." Chin turned back to face Marcus, her expression becoming more animated as she warmed to her subject. What bothered me most about my situation wasn't the lack of recognition, it was the precedent it set. If the Navy is going to ask personnel to take on unofficial responsibilities, there needs to be a framework for ensuring that those contributions are properly acknowledged, even if that acknowledgement comes later. Marcus found himself impressed by Chin's analytical approach to her own situation. She had clearly thought deeply about the broader implications of the investigation beyond her personal circumstances. Admiral Morrison mentioned that you're being assigned to a new position that will make better use of your skills, Marcus said. Chin nodded enthusiastically. I'm being assigned to a joint task force that's developing next-generation communication systems for special operations. It's exactly the kind of work I've been hoping to do, and it builds on the experience I gained during my time at the training facility. She returned to her seat and regarded Marcus with an expression of genuine gratitude. Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that your decision to reveal the truth about Neptune's fork has had consequences beyond what you probably intended. The task force I'm joining exists partly because Admiral Morrison's investigation highlighted the need for better integration of technical specialists into special operations. Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction, realizing for the first time that his actions might have had positive consequences that extended beyond Chin's individual situation. Chun continued. The investigation also resulted in new policies for handling personnel who volunteer for unofficial assignments. There's now a framework for ensuring that such contributions are properly documented and recognized, even if that documentation remains classified. As their conversation continued, Marcus found himself increasingly impressed by Chin's perspective on the situation. She had managed to extract positive lessons from what could have been a career-ending experience, and she clearly understood the broader implications of the issues his investigation had raised. Petty Officer Chun, can I ask you about your experience during Operation Neptune's Fork? I've read the official reports, but I'd be interested in your first-hand perspective. Chin's expression became more serious as she considered his question. The mission itself was successful, but it was also more complex than the official reports indicate. The communications challenges were significant, and the unofficial nature of my participation created some operational complications. She paused, seeming to weigh how much detail she could share. Without going into classified specifics, I can tell you that the decision to include me in the mission was made at the last minute when it became clear that the assigned communications specialist didn't have the specific skills needed for the operation. Chin's account provided Marcus with insight into how the decision to include her unofficially had been made. It hadn't been a deliberate attempt to circumvent regulations, but rather an operational necessity that had been handled through unofficial channels because official procedures couldn't accommodate the timeline. The problem, Chin continued, was that once the mission was complete, there was no established procedure for transitioning my participation from unofficial to official status. The easiest solution seemed to be to simply omit my involvement from the record. Marcus began to understand that the issues his investigation had uncovered weren't the result of deliberate wrongdoing, but rather systemic gaps in how the Navy handled operational flexibility within rigid bureaucratic structures. What you accomplished, Chin said, was forcing the Navy to develop better procedures for handling these kinds of situations. That's going to benefit a lot of people in the future. As their meeting drew to a close, Chin offered Marcus one final observation that would significantly influence his perspective on the entire investigation. Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that the people who were investigated as a result of your findings understood why you made the choice you did. Commander Sullivan, Chief Patterson, and the others weren't angry at you for following your conscience. They were frustrated by a system that put good people in impossible positions. Chin stood to leave, but paused at the door. The investigation was disruptive and stressful for everyone involved, but it was also necessary. Sometimes, systemic problems can only be addressed when someone has the courage to force uncomfortable conversations. After Chin left, Marcus sat alone in the conference room, processing their conversation and its implications for his understanding of the investigation's impact. For the first time since revealing the discrepancies in the Operation Neptune's Fork documentation, he felt genuinely confident that he had made the right choice. Chin's perspective had helped him understand that the investigation's value extended beyond correcting her individual situation. The systematic changes that resulted from his revelations would benefit future personnel who found themselves in similar circumstances. Over the next several days, Marcus noticed a gradual shift in how he was regarded by the personnel at the Naval Special Warfare Command. The suspicion and resentment that had characterized the previous weeks began to give way to a grudging respect for his commitment to accountability. Chief Patterson was among the first to explicitly acknowledge this change. 3 days after Marcus's meeting with Chun, the big man stopped by his office with an unexpected request. "Thompson, I owe you an apology. I was angry about the investigation and the disruption it caused, but I've had time to think about what you actually accomplished." Marcus looked up from his computer screen, surprised by the chief's conciliatory tone. Patterson continued, "The policy changes that came out of Admiral Morrison's investigation are going to prevent good people from getting caught in the kind of situation that Chin faced. That's worth some temporary disruption." The chief settled into the chair across from Marcus's desk, his expression more thoughtful than Marcus had ever seen it. "You know, Thompson, when I first heard what you had done, I thought you were some idealistic civilian who didn't understand how the real world works. But what you actually did was hold the system accountable to its own stated values." Marcus appreciated Patterson's acknowledgement, but he also understood that the chief's change of heart reflected a broader recognition of the investigation's positive outcomes. "Chief, I never wanted to cause problems for good people like you and Commander Sullivan. I just couldn't accept that someone's excellent service should be swept under the rug for political convenience." Patterson nodded slowly. "And that's exactly why what you did was important. Sometimes, it takes an outsider to see problems that we've learned to accept as normal." As the final week of Admiral Morrison's investigation approached, Marcus found himself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had transformed him from an invisible administrative aide to a catalyst for institutional change. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about the complexity of moral decision-making and the unintended consequences of principled action. The investigation's final report would soon be submitted to Navy leadership, and Marcus knew that his role in the events would become part of the permanent record. Whether that would prove to be an asset or a liability in his future career remained to be seen, but he had learned that some choices were worth making regardless of their personal consequences. Marcus Thompson had discovered that sometimes the most important contributions came not from following orders, but from having the courage to question whether those orders served the greater good. It was a lesson that would shape the remainder of his career and his understanding of what it meant to serve with integrity in an imperfect world.